Consistently inconsistent seems to be the best way to sum up this Norwich City side right now. 18 points dropped from winning positions. Another defeat today, and they're rooted bang in the middle of the Championship table. Welcome to this week's edition of the PinkUn.com Norwich City podcast. I'm your host, Connor Southwell, and I'm joined by the three Scrooges, Paddy Davitt, Seaman and Adam Harvey, to pick through what was an eventful afternoon at Carrow Road, and one that ultimately ended by Burnley taking all 3 points and winning 2-1 to apply some more pressure at the top of the Championship, where Norwich City currently are not. Paddy, let's get some reflection and some analysis for you, because actually there was a lot of today that was very good, and there was a lot of today that was probably not so good, and that in many ways encapsulates where this Norwich City team are under Johannes Hoff Thorup, 21 games into their new era.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, it was everything he said in a lot of these press conferences of late about, you know, we're moving out of the first phase to the second phase of what he's trying to build now, and there might be backward steps to go forward again, and the progress or the curve, and he's used his hands to sort of demonstrate it's going to be more sort of haphazard in terms of zigzagging line of progress than straight up, which it felt like that's what they were set for prior to, really, I mean, you could go back, I suppose, to that 3-game losing week they had just prior to the international break. But, of course, you know, we wrapped a lot of mitigation around that in terms of injuries, but can't do that so much now, really. It's just more evidence for me that everything he's been talking about is coming to light, that this is going to take a considerable amount of time now, I think, and multiple windows as well, which is pertinent as we approach January. That'll only be the second one him and Napper have had a go at reshaping the squad. And I guess the subtext to it for me now is, other Norwich fans, or at least a large constituency of them, are they understanding that is where we're at now with this group of players and this football club? And, you know, that's not a lack of ambition, but it would seem quite a stretch to say that they could get themselves in a promotion shake-up on the evidence of where we are now this far into the season, this season. You know, we've seen evidence with a benchmarking game today against a team who will be in the automatic conversation. And just in that second half, you could see they had a bit more maturity, a bit more streetwise edge to their play. They had some very good players to bring on, and that's how they got their equaliser, obviously through Kian Fleming's 30-yard strike. But, you know, Norwich didn't have any of that, and everything that was good about the first half, it wasn't there in the second half, and that is partly down to what Burnley did, but it's also maybe partly where this Norwich group are as a collective. And that's frustrating because, as I say, I can't remember what pod it was, but there was one or two pods where I think we had quite a big segment on, haven't we been a bit stupid to sort of benchmark 12th as a finishing position before a ball was kicked. Didn't look that stupid after Oxford, I have to be said, but thereafter, when it was the Watfords and the Hulls and going to Derby and winning there for the first team to do that in quite a considerable amount of time, and the style of play and how they were achieving those results as well, you just thought, well, this is well ahead of schedule, and 12th would seem to be very unambitious on what we're seeing. But, you know, rolling it on now to this point of the season, that feels like where this group are, and of course that's where they are currently in the table. You know, they're good when they are good, but when they're not, then we see that, you know, the better teams in this division will punish them, and it's just trusting the process now. If you think Thorup is the man and Napper is the man and Atanasio is the man now, that triumvirate effectively to drive this forward, you have to give them the time and the space to put the procedures in place that over a period of time now will hopefully get them in a position where they are realistically competing for promotion, and then if they can get themselves up, then they have a good attempt at staying there. But that's way into the distance right now, I think, is what we probably felt when we came up with those predictions, a transition season, and every passing week now would seem that is the case. We are very much in a transitional phase of Norwich City Football Club.
Yeah, agreed. And again, Sam, I'll say it again, it feels like a game that almost perfectly encapsulated that, because we saw a Norwich team that when they're on it, when they're playing well, when they're playing in the way they want to with confidence and they've got a lead, they can not just match the better sides, the top teams in this division, but they can outplay them. And they did that against Burnley in the first half, without probably creating too much, but certainly that deep build-up phase is as good as we've seen them in a little while. And then, you know, on the flip side of that, you get QPR and you get Oxford and you get Sheffield Wednesday, albeit that one was in mitigation, where the performance levels are so far off it. And ultimately, when you combine those two things, you get a 12th place finish, which is, and obviously we've got plenty of the season to go, but that's where they sit currently, and it feels probably like a fair reflection of where this team is at.
Yeah, I think it's always funny with these sorts of seasons because we go into it the whole time saying it's going to be transitional, Norwich are going to be inconsistent, they might finish mid-table, and I think that's where we all had them sort of going into the season. And then throughout you end up having this debate, oh, are they slightly better than we thought they were? Are they slightly worse than we thought they were? And not to pat ourselves on the back, but I think it turns out us and probably the large majority of fans were actually pretty right at the start of the season, and that when you do things like this, it does usually end up looking something like this. And there are so many parallels with the last time Norwich went for a sort of long-term rebuild, and I think we're seeing those on a pretty regular basis. So yeah, the ceiling is quite high, the floor is pretty low, and I think it's just proof that the very best teams in football, consistency is what defines them. And you look at Burnley and the fact that they're definitely going to be in the promotion race come the end of the season. That's what the best teams do. They certainly weren't at their best today. They didn't look anywhere near as good as their record this season suggests, maybe not even their league position. But they found a way to beat a pretty solid Norwich side, I thought, on the day, and that's what the best teams do. Not just because they're going to be poor every week and have to grind things out like that, but just because they're consistent and they find ways to do it on a really regular basis. And obviously the task now for Thorup, and we always say this is the hardest part of football, but is to take that ceiling and make sure Norwich are hitting it as regularly as possible. That's the difference for me between what they are now and what they hope to be in the future. But yeah, I thought, as you've said, today really underlined that, and it showed exactly what Norwich are as a team at the moment.
And it's difficult for fans, isn't it, Adam? Because I think it's much easier to say when you're in the situation that Norwich were in last year, and obviously they snuck into the top six and they got into the playoffs, and we can maybe talk about what happened in terms of the playoffs. They were so far off it was untrue. And I think a lot of the way that Norwich have operated over the last probably since they were relegated from the Premier League has felt very sticking plaster and felt very short term, be it from the head coach appointments to the players that they've recruited, some of which they're obviously still feeling the pain of at this moment in time, be it because they're still in the building and still earning a lot of money on relatively big contracts, or some that maybe they paid money for that didn't quite work out, or whatever. So it's all very well and good saying that when you're in the middle of last season and you go on the run that Norwich are on, but actually the hardest bit is now when you're in that transition season, and because no football fan wants to talk about things taking time. They want to see their team winning, and they want to see their team winning now. So it comes back to what Paddy said. It's about that understanding point. So where do you think Norwich City fans are on this? Because there have been points when Norwich have been trying to play out from the back at Carrow Road, and there's been a few groans and nothing major. I don't want to overplay anything, but you've maybe sensed that there is some impatience in some quarters, which I guess is understandable, because it's all very well and good talking about a season like this, but it's harder living it.
Yeah, I think life of a football fan, it's emotional, much like it is for the players. And when your team's doing well, the city's buzzing. You feel it around when you're sort of walking around, and the fans are loud. And you didn't really get that sense today. Even in the second half, it was quite quiet, and there was kind of that frustration starting to boil under, which is understandable because the performance level in the second half was quite poor relative to the first half. And I think probably what's been the upside is that the home form and home performances have generally been a little bit better than more on the road. So maybe those sort of home paying supporters have seen it a little bit better than those that have had to make those long trips to Swansea and Cardiff and Sheffield and all these various places we've been in QPR in recent weeks, where it's not been as good as what it's been in those 6-1 victories over Plymouth and 4-2 against Luton. But I also think there is still a willingness from those fans within the fan base. Look today, Sinat's very young, Svartau very young, Fisher very young, and it's quite clear that the players off the bench are not of the same level to those that are starting, and some of those that are injured. So I think a lot of fans know it's going to take time, and because Norwich fans have lived it before under Farker, and they sort of saw glimmers of certain performances which were really good, and then they also had those performances at Millwall away and various other places, Sheffield Wednesday away, and it was so poor. And I think the fact they knew what was then round the corner with Farker and what happened, I think they're almost maybe going to start judging, hopefully, a little bit more harshly next season. But it is the life of a football fan. When results aren't going your way, you are going to be frustrated. So I think that's a bit understandable. And it's still a team that's growing in terms of their identity and their style. And I think when the fans maybe fully get on board with it and they understand it a little bit more, then they'll appreciate what the players are trying to do at the moment.
Yes, and this is the nature of it, Paddy, isn't it? Because when Norwich are trying to make a change and they're trying to move to something new, you do end up with runs like this where, you can put two wins together against Plymouth and against Luton and things look good, but then you zoom out a little bit and it's 2 wins in 11, which is, as a run of form, is not great. A lot of draws in that as well, and obviously some of the defeats we understand mitigated with injuries as well. But it's sort of, to hook it onto that discussion, it can be a lot harder to live through a season like this as a fan than maybe it is to talk about it and hope for what's to come, because there's no guarantee that what follows this season is a 18-19 campaign. It could be longer than that. It could be more steps required. It could be a longer return. You look at, I use Brentford as an example. They had to build for 7 years at this level to get to a stage, and that included some heartbreaking playoff defeats and whatnot along the way. So who knows how long this road could be for Norwich City?
Well, that's it, and nobody can really, because nobody has the benefit of looking into the future and telling us this will lead to yes, that is the aim, to get back to the Premier League and then stay there, but no guarantees. I mean, we've seen is it earlier today, Oxford have got rid of Des Buckingham, who did an unbelievable job getting that club into the Championship for the first time in 25-30 years. No sentiment there. Things haven't gone well for him this season back in the Championship, and they dispensed with him. He's an Oxford fan as well, Oxford lad, was with the club in the academy. So, that tells you there is in amongst the emotion and the passion and the affection maybe for clubs, that there is some serious pragmatic, hard-headed, brutal decision making that goes on by football people inside the game, and Johannes will be well aware of that. So he will know he wasn't brought to this club to plateau out into 3 or 4 Championship seasons. He was very candid when he first came through the door that I think he signed a 3-year deal, didn't he? And he thought he would expect, and Glenn Riddison more or less followed that up, that by the end of that contractual length they will be back in the Premier League. That is the aim. So ultimately that's what they'll be judged by. Is this group of players under this head coach developing along a path where you think, yes, they will get to the Premier League? And if more Norwich fans than not believe that to be the case, then I think the time and the patience will be afforded them. But what they need in return is more of the good results and performances, and less of some of them games you referenced, Connor. So at the minute we're in a bit of a holding pattern, it feels, really, as a season, and as a result, as a evolutionary path under Thorup. I sense he's a little bit frustrated by it, because he would have thought maybe once they'd got things, that sense of momentum was building, and they were getting themselves in and around the top 6 positions, really close to, and they looked like their brand of football was very difficult to counteract, particularly at Carrow Road. I'm sure he would not now, if he'd have rolled it on to the start of December, expecting them to be where they are, playing as they are. So, but then, he would also, I'm sure, know full well that this is a pretty unforgiving league. Plenty of people would have told him that, and now he's living it for the first time, and he's learning on the job as well. And we have to reiterate, this is a guy who had no experience of English football, less of the Championship, and like Farker, they have to go on a journey, these coaches, and understand rotation of players when you've got such a congested fixture schedule, for example, as one facet. Teams trying to counteract what you want to do by less about tactics, more about breaking up play and stopping the game and fouls and booting the ball out of play and not having it in play as much, as I'm sure that's all come as a bit of a shock to him, reading between the lines. And so this is it. It's not just the players who are on this path. It's him and his coaching team as well. So yeah, I think the reality is, you'd like to think that there will be a step forward, and we get to a point where maybe by the end of the season, if they're not in that promotion conversation, at least the signs are more positive than negative, because then it's all about building into another summer window, which will be key, and then really attacking the league. And some of the mitigation that's on the table at the minute that I've just talked about there, about a new manager in a new league, new players, that won't be the case, and that'll be the time to judge them, as Adam rightly says. It isn't this season, I don't think. While still hoping that they will serve up a bit more consistency to push them a little bit higher up the table. I think the time to judge him and his group of players will be next season, I think.
Yeah, and I guess that maybe feeds this conversation into this week, Sam, which, you think about the week before this week, which was obviously the return from internationals, that draw at West Brom, that victory over Plymouth, the win over Luton. There were signs there that perhaps slowed, and even maybe before the injuries that they had for the final 3 games of that period before the November break, where they win at Cardiff and maybe the pitch looks very different. So it's just felt like a few times there's been a few false starts this season. I guess this week kind of encapsulates probably the frustration of what we're talking about, because you have the 10-goal week against Plymouth and Luton, and you come to a week now where they've scored 1 goal and picked up 1 point. That's what this team is and where it's at this moment in time.
Yeah, and I think it's probably down to the sort of squad that they are, the age of the players maybe, and the relative inexperience, because the pattern seems to be that momentum does swing on literally 1 game. So they win one and it seems that everyone's delighted and it's very positive and the confidence is clearly there in the players. But then as soon as they lose one, it feels like that does a complete 180 and those players are feeling quite negative about things, or at least that's how it feels on the pitch, and that is a theme that sort of is developing over this season, that things are changing very, very quickly. And I know we talk often about how quickly things do change in football, and especially in the Championship, but this to me feels like it's more than it usually would, and I think that fact, along with a lot of other things with this team, comes down to that sort of relative inexperience, the fact that they're still getting used to each other, that there is this transition and this change, that everything is a bit up and down, and maybe there isn't that rhythm to things that you see at times. And for all the criticism that David Wagner got last season and that Norwich got, and it wasn't an amazing watch at times, but you did feel that maybe within positive runs they could come through a little bit of adversity. And obviously we saw the huge negative momentum swing that they had in the autumn last year, but it felt like in that run to the playoffs there were a couple of damaging draws and things like that didn't really then lead to 3 or 4 games where Norwich wouldn't be at their best. But right now it feels like they're a little bit more vulnerable and a little bit more things are changing and the momentum is changing a little bit quicker, and I think that is a sign of the sort of player that they've got. And of course there are plenty of positives to having that type of player and that youth that I think Norwich fans wanted to see, and I think for the long-term future of the club is positive. But right now in the short term, I think that's probably quite a big factor in the inconsistency that we're seeing from Norwich at the moment.
So you'll appreciate this analogy, Adam, because I know you're going through a bit of it at the moment. But it's a bit like a house renovation, isn't it? You've opened the front door and you realise the walls need decorating, and you pull the wallpaper off, and actually there's a few more holes than you expected, and perhaps it's a bit crumbly. And then you go upstairs and there's another issue, and you fix one thing and then something else, and I don't know, a window falls out or something, and there's a few bits in there that 5 years ago would have been really good and would have functioned in a really good way, and now suddenly 5 years on they're beginning to look a little bit older, and you're thinking maybe I need to do something here. And that's kind of where it feels like Norwich are at the moment. It is wholesale changes that they're trying to incorporate, because it's not just a new style of play that they're throwing onto the table. It's young players in there. It's naturally with young players you get a swing of inconsistency. You get weeks where they look excellent and weeks where they look really, really poor and maybe don't look like they're where Norwich City need them to be. So you put all of that on the table, and it's probably understandable that Norwich are where they are, because they've ripped off a sticking plaster, and you've got to deal with the big gaping wound that you've got left behind. I think I've used 2 analogies there, but it's fine. You know what I'm getting at. Yeah,
it still feels a little bit like a squad that's maybe had a few occupants, I suppose you could say. You've obviously got the sort of players from still that Daniel Farke era, the likes of Grant Hanley and Kenny McLean. You've got the David Wagner types, you've got the Dean Smith types, you've now got this sort of new influx of younger unknowns from the championship, coming to the championship for the first time, the likes of Sienats and Force and Svartal that are going to take time, and you've even got sort of in a higher up position. You've obviously had the transition at the top and all the various coaching sort of elements that have changed, and I just think everything's going to need a period of time. And as you mentioned, I think probably some of those holes that maybe even Thorup and his coaching staff weren't aware of have started to become a little bit more visible, I suppose, in recent weeks. And I think that all boils back to the point about patience. Is going to take time. And I think there's plenty of clubs in the Championship that, have probably a marker for Norwich. I mean, I know Sunderland have had a bit of a dip in recent weeks, but for me, they're a similar kind of club in the way they sort of almost made a point of just signing younger players at one point, and you could see they had flashes of brilliance, some of these individual players, and maybe they were being carried by Jack Clark for a period, which is kind of almost a little bit where Norwich are at, I suppose, at the moment with Borja signs, and then gradually these younger players have started to kind of understand the Championship, understand what's expected of them, and those sort of holes have maybe started to go away, and they now have a core of a squad that can compete. And I just think that's kind of where Norwich have got to benchmark themselves against. I know obviously Sunderland have had a little bit of a different journey to this point than what Norwich have had, in that they had to come out of League One and adapt back to the Championship. But I think that's almost a model that has worked at the moment. Certainly, I know they've had a bit of a dip in form, but certainly in and around the playoff picture at the moment. And I just think that's what Norwich have got to do, and try and eradicate these holes generally as every window. I mean, Thorup actually said it in his pre-match press conference that it was going to take, span a lot of windows. There's going to be a lot of work to do, and I think that's quite evident still at the moment. Even the news we're probably going to talk about with Ashley Barnes being linked away, and just individuals that maybe some of them aren't fully on board with it still at the moment, or don't quite fit what they're trying to do, and it's going to take time. But hopefully they get to a point where they're going to be competitive and have a good young squad that the Norwich fans can buy into, and they can sort of have a connection with, forge a connection with, because I think there's lots of individuals in there that want to do that with the fans. So let's hope it turns for the better.
And that's the hard bit, because for the fans, it's always about the next game. So the thing occupying solely their brain for the next week is going to be Sunderland away and winning that. But actually inside, it's that is almost not an irrelevance, because that's not true. But it's a step, isn't it, almost? And actually, what's more important to maybe where Norwich are at the moment and Thorup and Napa is actually, right, how do we look in 3 months' time, 4 months' time, 6 months' time? And that's reality. And when you've moved away from what they have been, particularly over the last season, I think, which was just all about the next game constantly, to break that cycle is difficult, and it probably creates a little bit of what we're seeing at the moment. Paddy and Adam's right, and there's different variations to the squad that we can get to, and in reality it's probably where Norwich are, in between different elements across the squad, across the coaching team, across the strategy as well, and that probably creates what we're seeing at the moment on the pitch.
Yeah, I mean, we had a conversation on the walk back up the hill from the stadium there earlier, and pretty much everything that's driving us forward, this strategy, is mid to longer term. It's not in the here and now. It's whether that be results, whether that be about recruiting players. It's to evolve to a point where, it's a very good analogy Adam draws with Sunderland, that you can get to a point where there's a more organic way of trying to get out of the division, as they did brilliantly under Farker first time round. But do they also need to maybe pay a little bit more heed to the here and now? In terms of giving themselves almost the credit in the bank to then, go to supporters and say, yeah, we're telling you it's going to take time, but here's some evidence, circumstantial evidence we can put on the table right here, right now. And to be fair to them, there's been plenty of games this season they could do that. But what I would fear is that when we get to May, if there's more negative performances than positive, in that sense, in terms of a progressive step that they're trying to take, that makes it a lot harder to sell that to your fan base then. So it definitely needs to tip the other way by the end of this season. And maybe, whether it's January or it's the summer, they do need to give a little bit more thought to, within the context of lowering age profiles and wanting to bring in players that they can develop onwards in terms of transfer value. That's all well and good. But I think the problem is, it's been highlighted now, when you had no Sargent, you had no McLean, you had no Gunn, you had no Nunes. The ones stepping up are not ready, they're nowhere near ready. And the gap from them to the frontline options is too big if you want to be churning out results in the Championship. And so if that is the case, then maybe they need to have a look at that. But easier said than done. But that inconsistency that we're now experiencing in terms of the results, I think that's there in the squad, because, it is a bit of a... feels like it's maybe tipped too far towards either one end of this age spectrum, which is obviously players that Thorup's inherited in the main, and then obviously the ones they have brought in this past summer, which may go on to be very good players, but in the here and now they're not ready. So maybe you need something somewhere in between, and that's a difficult one, because the accusation or the challenge might be, well, that's not really what your strategy is, but that's all well and good. But I think you also need to be mindful that there needs to be enough evidence for your fan base that they stay with you on this journey.
Yeah, and therein is sort of the plate spinning act, really, isn't it? Because and probably, to be fair, as we saw on Tuesday night at Portsmouth, there is a short term element that you can't ignore. And I mean, to take you back to that sort of 17-18 campaign, Pad, just to bounce back at you if you're okay enough to bounce back too. But I remember particularly around sort of the early 18-19 cycle, but probably even before that, there were real question marks of Farke. You think pre that Ipswich game where Max Aarons was thrown in and whatnot. There was question marks about him and the direction of travel that they were going on. And that first year wasn't huge. There were similarities, but completely different in terms of the way they did, and a slightly different strategy as well, because that wasn't necessarily about young players in the way that Norwich City are going about it now. That was kind of about overseas players and German players. I mean, Vrancic wasn't a younger type at that stage. Stiepermann wasn't a younger type at that stage. So there are similarities, but there are differences. But it goes to say, even after that first season that Farke had, it could have gone very, very differently had that game at Portman Road gone different for Norwich.
Absolutely, yeah. And fine margin, sliding doors moments, and yeah. I mean, as I said earlier, with Farke, he had to go on a journey in terms of style of play, in terms of players, in terms of fit for purpose for the Championship. And the genius of that man was that it came together after one season where they finished 15th below Ipswich. So it can be done in a relatively abbreviated time frame, but I think that was pretty exceptional that it came together as swiftly as that, and it just proved so ahead of the curve in the Championship. You remember that 17-18 season, they were so good and so far ahead of the opponents in that league. I think it's probably expecting a little bit too much that Thorup can hit those levels, but there's going to have to be something that is a little bit more than what we're seeing now.
Agreed. Right, let's do a bit in the game, Sam, to finish off part one, because I think the first half of what we saw today, a lot of it was very, I wouldn't say perfect, but it was very good. Norwich playing out and playing through, often a very good Burnley press, and Burnley, I think Scott Parker said post game wasn't their best start to a game, but a lot of that was because of what Norwich did and how they played.
Yeah, I thought the start was actually really, really good, and you wonder whether that came from scoring so early on, because part of the temptation would have been, okay, you've got a lead now, you're playing against a team that many expect to be in and around that promotion race. It almost felt like it could be a bit of a curse, because then a lot of teams would have been, naturally, even if it wasn't the plan, they would have ended up sitting quite deep on the edge of their area, and they wouldn't have been proactive enough, which maybe actually in the end, ironically, was the problem for Norwich. But their response to that goal, I thought, was maybe the most impressive bit, because so many times this season we've seen them not respond in the best way to either scoring or conceding. But they didn't sit off. They went and tried to get that second. They wanted to assert their position in the game, and ultimately I think their intentions were proven right, because the failure to get that second was probably a big part of the reason they didn't end up winning that game. But yeah, I thought the most impressive bit was how they played out against a team that has been pretty solid defensively, and they managed to pass through them really, really well. They looked pretty calm, and although there were a couple of times where the crowd was certainly a little bit nervy, and probably we all were too, in terms of what might happen next, every time it ended up being, for the greater good, and Norwich managed to find that space to then attack the Burnley defence, and they created a couple of opportunities, maybe nothing especially clear-cut, but they could have had a couple of goals if they had taken all of their chances. And I thought it was really, really encouraging, and like you said earlier, the fact that they can do that against a team that is doing as well as Burnley are at this stage of the season bodes really, really well. And there were plenty of positive elements. but ultimately it just came down to the fact that they couldn't carry that out over 90 minutes, and it's hard for any team to do that, to be at their best for a full 90 minutes, but you have to sort of build it up, and you have to do it for 60 minutes and then 75 and then 90, and we probably only saw that from Norwich for 45 today. And although it was very, very good and very encouraging for the future, that was where the problem was, that they weren't able to carry it out for any longer than that.
Yeah, and it's also about in the periods where you dip your performance, making sure your performance drops to a level that is enough to ride you through those periods where you dip a little bit or your opponent grows into the game, and that's probably the bit that we're looking at, Adam. But also again we're talking about small details, aren't we? Because you look at the 2 goals that Burnley scored. The first one comes from, I think we were probably more awake to Burnley's short free kick than most of Norwich City's team were. But also the second goal, which came from probably a poor decision initially from Borja Sainz. But to be fair to him, what followed afterwards was a complete mess defensively.
Yeah, I think, for what was so good in the first half in terms of Norwich's defence, and even at Portsmouth, the way they defended it in that game, just those moments where they switched off, which has kind of been their Achilles heel at different points this season, was quite evident again. And against a team like Burnley, who have the quality players they do, many of which are probably still of a Premier League grade in certain areas, you can't afford to do that because you get punished. And then that probably lends itself back to the point where in the first half, where they had plenty of opportunities going forward, you almost need to strike while the iron's hot and get the second, and probably try and kill them off quite early, because 1-0 is a dangerous scoreline at any point in a game, particularly given it was so early on as well in the game. After 1 minute, you're never going to sit back and hold a team of Burnley out for 89 minutes, sort of, and allowing them to almost insert, or I suppose, put their sort of stamp on the game and allow them into it. So it's frustrating because they also still had those moments in the second half. I mean, Marcondes, I'd imagine he'll be ruined that missed opportunity at the end, because it was very similar to Brownhill in terms of he just snatched at it, and that's going to be the frustration, and where Norwich hopefully will continue to learn, because in those moments you've got to take your opportunities, and unfortunately for them in the second half they didn't. And that naivety maybe still with some of these younger players that are still adapting to this league, kind of came through, and that's where they ultimately lost the game.
Yes, I spoke to Emi Marcondes after the game. I don't think he's going to be sleeping a lot tonight from what he was saying. I think he's just going to have that chance going over and over and over in his mind. So there we go. That probably brings us to a close in part 1. I will actually end by asking you guys a very simple question. Are we all looking forward to Christmas? You can nod or shake or appropriate. Yeah, there's a couple of nods, and I think Paddy's
more looking forward not to having a cough and a cold. To be brutally honest. It's been like 3 weeks now. So.
I know. Paddy's struggling on. But what Christmas does mean, it means lots of football, and obviously Norwich City at home on Boxing Day this season. I think we're all quite grateful about that. We've seem to have been on the road for certainly the last few Christmases. So they're at home on the 26th, and they're also at home on the 29th against QPR. And our sponsors, First Bus, are running buses on Boxing Day. So to tell us a little bit more about them and the operation that they're going to be doing on Boxing Day is Zach, who was on our last podcast. He's here to tell us more.
Yes, that's right, Connor. First Bus will be operating services on Boxing Day in Norwich for the first time in a while. And that's to help your listeners, the Norwich City fans, get to and from the game in an affordable and sustainable way. So obviously, I know you've mentioned last week, we've got the Festive 5 group ticket going on at the moment, and that's a ticket available on the First Bus app, which allows any 5 people of all ages to travel for £10 all day. I mean, that's £1 each journey pretty much if you're making, a trip there and a trip back. So that's really good value. And now you'll be able to use that on Boxing Day to get to the game. So we're operating hourly services on the Pink Line 11, the Orange Line 21, the Red Line 23, Blue Lines 25 and 26, and the Purple Line 37. So we've tried to cover as much of the city as we can, whilst also giving our drivers a chance to have a rest, because they work really hard and they only get 1 day off, or 2 days, with New Year's Day as well. The services will be starting between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning, and they'll be operating hourly throughout the day. And to make sure that you've got enough time to get back to the city centre from Carrow Road on the Boxing Day, the last buses on each of those services will be leaving Castle Meadow or Red Line Street somewhere between 5:30 and 6:30. So make sure you check specific timetables for your journey, and that's available on the First Bus website. So if you head to firstbus.co.uk/Eastern Counties, Scroll down to the bottom of the homepage, you'll see a little blue box. If you click on that, it says your festive timetables. Click on that blue box and that'll take you to our webpage, which has all the information that you will need for early finishes and whatnot on Christmas Eve. But it's also got the Boxing Day services on it as well. And there's a PDF that you can click on and download and have a look to find out when your specific bus leaves the city centre. So we're hoping lots of you guys will use it. And we're looking forward to going out there and getting another 3 points against Millwall at home on Boxing Day.
Welcome back to part 2 of the PinkUn.com Norwich City podcast, brought to you in association with First Bus, obviously reflecting after Norwich City's defeat to Burnley at Carrow Road this afternoon. And Paddy, I guess if we maybe broaden the week out, it's not been great, has it? That QPR defeat, which we obviously dissected in a lot of detail, but we probably haven't had an opportunity to speak about Portsmouth, which, for all of the discussion, I think, in the first part of the pod about inconsistency in long term, that probably was Johannes thinking about the short term in the way that Norwich City approached it, because I think, as Adam, to be fair, coined it, so he can take the credit of this, it was more hoofball than Hoffball at Fratton Park on Tuesday night.
That was an excellent, you made a piece around that, which was the good hook on that.
Not just a pretty face, Adam.
No. But up Fratton Park, on a personal level, it been one of those grounds I hadn't been to, so I was quite looking forward to it. If I never go again, it won't be too soon. What a hole! But the people were very friendly. The people, before anybody tracks me down from a Portsmouth direction, but the people were very friendly. But as a stadium, it was it matched. Basically, that game deserved to be in a stadium like that for me. So no redeeming features, and I've basically come back from there with more flu. So that's another reason why I'm hating on that place. And that was on a serious note, so far removed from Hoffball. But we had a lot of debate around that, and I guess if you've got 2, maybe at most 3 training sessions between the QPR debacle and going to Portsmouth, probably not even that, maybe 1 or 2. Very difficult to put something in place that is maybe a bit more nuanced than what they did. It was very much, we'll go there, we'll roll our sleeves up, we'll head and kick everything we can that moves in our boxes, and hopefully maybe nick something. And as it turned out, Marcondes had an excellent chance that day. If you remember, he had that glancing header from about 8-9 yards out in the first half. That was probably as good as it got. But no, that was not a good experience.
We saw a fox, didn't we?
I was excited about that.
Yeah,
I quite enjoyed that.
Did you see, actually, on the theme of foxes and Norwich City, that obviously we were at QPR last year when the fox fell from the upper tier to the lower tier. But actually, the other night, I don't know if it was the same fox, I hope it was, but they had one in the gantry that I think they were a bit concerned was going to threaten kick-off, but we're digressing massively here. And obviously, Sam, we've got to talk about Kenny McLean and Kenny McLean's arm and retrospective FA action. I've calmed down a bit about it now, but the whole thing, I think, just in terms of, we can park what you think of the decision. The whole process of it feels fundamentally flawed. And also, I tell you what I've had a growing issue with as the week has got older, because the FA can only take retrospective action if they've asked the match official who says, I haven't seen it. I cannot understand from the position that he has had, even in his peripheral vision, how he hasn't seen what occurring. The only thing I can think of is that it basically let him off the hook for maybe taking action that clearly the FA feel that Kenny McLean deserved. But just on the whole episode, we're going to have to walk around like this now in case we get retrospective 4-game bans. But yeah, not a good one, I don't think. And surprise, there were no retrospective bans for anyone else this weekend.
It's one that just raises so many questions on so many different levels. The one for me was how have they ended up looking at it? Because obviously somebody is...
It's a Loftus Road fox, I reckon.
Well, yeah. But it's just... either somebody is there watching literally 90 minutes from every single EFL game, which...
fair play to them
if that's your job, then that's diligent. It's either that or someone's flagged it, but you wouldn't think QPR are going to be too bothered.
The only one that I could maybe think of was like a referee assessor, but even then, without the access to replays constantly, I'm not sure how you'd be raising that on the day of a game.
Well, I think there was a bit of a kerfuffle around it, and there was sort of I definitely remember the separation between McLean and the guy who went down, and there was a bit of a referee involvement there. But even that I'd forgotten about by half time. And yeah, if we just the decision itself. Yeah, I mean,
I think that sums up quite nicely, to be honest.
Yeah, I could probably leave it there. But I've met a few people who sort of understand it and they say like, yeah, it's fair enough. But for me, first of all, it's not really high enough to be dangerous. It's sort of like collarbone height at most, maybe even sort of chest height. Secondly, I've heard a few people making the point that sort of he looks at the player first, which can be, if it's completely unrelated to the game that's going on, then it can be a defence and it can be a reason why somebody, it's evidence for somebody wanting to hurt somebody else because they've looked at them to sort of to make sure they can catch them in the best possible way. But I think the reason he does that is because there's a throw-in taking place right in front of him, and the player is trying to get in front of him so that if the ball does come to him, he can take the ball first. McLean is just trying to use his body to sort, and I think the other arm comes out at the same time as well. So it's not.
He's trying to block him, isn't he?
Exactly. He's just trying to get his body in front of him, and make sure he's that side of the ball so that if it comes in his direction, he's getting there first. I don't think there's any malice in it whatsoever, and yeah, I think you have to feel for Kenny McLean, and we saw him actually going into the ground at Fratton Park, and I've rarely seen a man more devastated.
He looked before the game how I felt after the game.
Yeah, and probably a lot of people during, to be fair. But yeah, I mean, on a lot of levels, I would question it, and there's obviously nothing Norwich can do about it now. But yeah, at the time, it was hard to know where to start with that one. So we could probably have just left it at me, at my bewilderment, trying to find some words to sum it up, because yeah, just quite a difficult situation to try and work out, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, at some stage, Adam, the FA are going to release their written reasons as to why maybe they came to the conclusion they did, which is going to make for interesting reading. If anyone's interested, they are out there for his Middlesbrough ban, so you can find out the exact words he did say to the referee, which you have to read in a Scottish accent, I think, but they're quite amusing in hindsight. Not that he used the language, obviously, but you know what I mean. But in a serious note, from a Norwich City perspective, I think now it's 12 games, or the last 12 games that Kenny McLean has missed. That's spanning seasons, obviously, but they haven't picked up a win in any of them, which probably shows how important a figure he is. To be looking again at 2 games for that, and one of them being a difficult trip to Sunderland, is a significant blow, particularly in a league that doesn't have VAR. To then be in a situation where we seem to be re-refereeing games is bizarre, quite frankly.
Yeah, he is. Officially one of the most crucial players in this Norwich City team. I know down the years, plenty of fans have disputed sort of him as an individual and whether he's up to the standard of Norwich and where they are, but I think it's been pretty clear actually in the games he's missed this season how much they miss him just as a driving force in the midfield, and particularly I think this season with this group, it's such a young group, lots of which have never experienced a championship before. The intensity of it, the rigour of it, the sort of amount of games they have to get through, and he's obviously one of those players who's been around the club for one of the longest now. I think only Grant Hanley's probably been here longer. He knows it inside out. He knows all the everybody and the league inside out. So he's probably the sort of player that those individuals will look up to, and particularly those difficult moments where they might be facing adversity. Even today, at 1-0, you probably, and Oscar Svartau, you're looking at the likes of a Kenny McLean to probably guide you through this kind of game, and that they missed that experience again today in the midfield area where they're particularly lacking. Obviously Sorensen's fitness has been an issue. Liam Gibbs obviously has been quite unfortunate with his various issues. Anis Ben Slimani's clearly still struggling a little bit with that fitness level. Marcelino Nunez, we know they're having to try and guide him back through various issues. So it leaves that midfield with even Marcondes, and didn't even have a club and still trying to get up to speed. So it's been pretty clear to me, that Kenny's probably the one player you require, because he's been pretty consistent, never really had that many injury spells throughout his time at Norwich, and if anything, he's probably missed more games through suspension, some of which is his own fault. Obviously the Middlesbrough one is a bit silly, a stupid tackle to make at that stage in the game, and obviously you can't dispute the language that's being used. Anybody can go and find out exactly what he said, and it's quite funny, but also not ideal for Norwich in that it meant another game. But this one, he's been really hard done by, and Norwich should rightfully feel hard done by, and I think Thorup was quite clever in his post-match in kind of the way he angled it towards the FA without maybe trying to get himself in any trouble. And it's quite interesting, maybe, I think, moving forward, particularly now we've got this kind of Christmas run of games coming up where there's, 4 or 5 games within sort of a couple of weeks. How many more bans are going to be handed out to various players? Because I sort of even the other night sat there and thought Ashley Barnes, when he sort of properly got his elbows out at one point, I thought, yep, that's a 4-game ban, which, you can argue whether that's a good or bad thing for Norwich. But but at this moment in time, it's you've got to question the state of English football referees, particularly, from everywhere, even the top to the bottom. But I think in the Championship this season, the standard referee, and I mean, as QPR sort of showed, the handball, the fact that the penalty, the fact that Thorup had a phone call, from those individuals to basically apologise for certain performances, and that doesn't mitigate Norwich's poor performance that day. They deserve to lose the game, but to then have the extra sucker punch of this, it's in disarray at the moment.
I don't think Kevin Friend's going to be ringing him anytime soon, is he? After that, and off the back of what was clearly very angry Johannes on Tuesday night.
Well, I mean, to bring it bang up to date, obviously anybody who wasn't at the game this afternoon, there was a. You can use the tabloid sort of words like melee, but there was a scuffle, shoving handbags. I'm not sure, maybe you can't use handbags now, but you know what I mean. But which was very bizarre. I don't think I've ever seen it before, where both sets of players were going around the Carrow Road perimeter, applauding their respective fan bases, and then something has triggered it. Words have clearly been exchanged, and for a moment it did look like it was going to boil over. It was quite a large number of players / coaching staff from both clubs. It diffused pretty swiftly, and the dialogue continued with, I think it was O'Neill and Glenn Riddisome, Grant Hanley and James Trafford, the Burnley keeper, and a Burnley official, as they made to the tunnel. But obviously we asked Johannes about that after the game, and not me, but one of the other reporters asked him, well, are you now fearful of another phone call from the FA, which is, the charge being failing to control your players? Which did produce a smile from Johannes. I think almost like, you're kidding me. I think he actually replied, "Do you work for the FA?" but he went on to say, no, he didn't expect a phone call. But given this dialogue here on Kenny McLean, that situation, I mean, let's not rule it out. Yeah, maybe Norwich and Burnley will be charged with failing to control their players, and if so, obviously that won't be individual players banned, will it? But it'll be another fine, presumably. And yet more red meat for the FA. But as Johannes did say, in the aftermath, I said to him, well, is this something you can use almost to create a siege mentality? And he was very swift in his belief, that's not for us, we don't need a them and us scenario. He wants good communication, good dialogue, as he had with Kevin Friend, as he had with the referee at QPR. He said he went and spoke to him after the game. It was all very cordial, because that's not his style, as he said. He's not one for ranting and raving, either in public or behind closed doors, you would imagine. So, but the more I think about it, would I be surprised if in the coming days there's a statement on the club sites of Burnley and Norwich saying they've been charged? No, I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, I think you've got to look at the role of Kenny McLean, haven't you? Is there any more games that you can add on there? Who his arms in an unnatural position? We can have that debate. Let's come on to Ashley Barnes then, Sam. It's been an interesting few days for him. Obviously started at Portsmouth and was probably the poster boy of their rugged hoofball style on Tuesday night, where he just seemed to sort of be wrestling with people and not really doing much else. Today, obviously, or in the build-up to this game, which on a Sunday, so we had some national reports out there this morning that Sheffield United are interested in him, which feels like kite flying to me, but there we go. What do you make of where he is at Norwich City at the moment? Because clearly heading into a January window, 6 months left on his deal, given everything that we've spoken about the strategy and the want for young players, doesn't, let's be honest, doesn't fit into that box now, does he, at 35? He's not probably one that you would consider a frontline option, particularly when Josh Sargent gets back fit and available. So it does feel like probably if there was something that could be arranged, and I don't know, I guess almost like a Jordan Hugill situation of a few years ago, someone would, he could go and get himself 18 months somewhere else. You've got to feel that Norwich probably would be willing to do that, given it gets his wages off the books 6 months earlier than planned, and who knows, may allow them to do some other bits in and around the squad.
Yeah, I think that's probably what it comes down to. It's unlikely, I think, that a club decides they're going to pay his wages for similar wages to what he's on at Norwich for a long-term basis. So it feels like the two likeliest routes would be the same pay for 6 months, and he goes for footballing or personal reasons, or he goes because he's able to, like a Hugo situation, secure his future as a professional footballer at hopefully a decent level for a bit longer. But yeah, he feels like one who they could offload in January, and it actually feels like there are quite a lot of players who would fit into that bracket, but it just depends obviously on the sort of interest. I will say he's not somebody who I expected to see in the starting lineup so quickly after he came back from injury, so maybe Thorup does still see a role for him, and I suppose there is room for him if you go in the direction that they did against Portsmouth. I thought, although there was a bit of grappling and a bit of wrestling and probably more of that than much on the ball, he did do a decent job of keeping those defenders occupied, and he held the ball up a decent amount. I don't think he's somebody who's going to be winning loads of headers and flicking the ball on, or scoring loads of goals from crosses, but I think he's decent at getting his body in the way and maybe waiting until he's got support higher up the pitch and doing that. The problem is just that you don't see Norwich doing that on a very regular basis, and is it worth having somebody on his wages to maybe play that role 2 or 3 more times over the next 6 months? And for me, the answer is unlikely to be yes. So we'll see what happens in January. I think it will come down to interest. But he's probably one of a few who, if an offer comes in and he wants to go, then Norwich would probably be fairly open to it, I would think.
Yeah, and Adam, there was a lot of chatter last January. Certainly, we heard lots of chatter last January that there was maybe a desire to go back north. And you think back initially, I remember one former Norwich official talking about maybe the difficulty they had to convince his sort of immediate family and around him that Norwich was the best place to go. So you could understand why at this stage, following what was a pretty big injury, that he'd want to go out and play at this stage of his career. And when we talk about kind of where Norwich are at, and they are in a stage of transition and moving to something new, where he's at his career, he probably needs something here and now, doesn't he? Which I guess in those realms would make sense as to maybe why Sheffield United would be mentioned. And you think about some of the strikers that Chris Wilder has had, Billy Sharp, Leon Clark in previous years, David McGoldrick, players who maybe are in that sort of stage of the career as to where he's at this moment in time.
Yeah, he needs to be playing week in, week out. He's obviously got limited period of time now left probably in his career. Obviously probably feels he needs to keep that fitness up, and unfortunately sitting around on a bench isn't going to do that for you, and particularly because he knows he's only got a maximum of 6 months left here, and that deal is very, very unlikely to be renewed, and he doesn't really maybe fit the project. And the fact you got Sargent back, as you mentioned, and Sienats is probably at least number 2 in reserve in that position, and obviously you've got the likes of Onel, who they've trialled in that kind of central striker role at different points, so it feels like they've got options there that will be enough to guide them through to the summer, where it's pretty clear that Norwich are going to have quite an upheaval in terms of those attacking areas, because there's lots of players that are out of contract or head back from their loan spells and various other things. So I'm intrigued to see how that all plays out. But in the here and now, I don't see really much point for Ashley Barnes to stick around. The only caveat, and me and Sam were actually talking about this on the way up, is the homegrown quota, obviously, that Norwich have got to be a little bit wary of, because they are sort of treading that line a little bit. So obviously they'd have to probably go back out in the market, and it depends on what they do obviously as well in January, because they've obviously got Kay Gordon as well and various other players that they would probably need to keep hold of, at least a few, just in terms of that number, or they'd have to go into the market and at least recruit individuals that fit that criteria. So intrigued to see how it all plays out, and I suppose it's all between the parties that are relevant, and whether Thorup can see a route for Barnes within this next sort of second half of the season, or whether Barnes really wants to commit to that, or whether he's looking further forward and what's next. Because it's I suppose in the summer maybe he's got a little bit more flexibility and more options available to him, maybe more than the January window. But if you're him with the limited time frame he's got left ahead, it's probably just about trying to go out there, find somewhere, settle in, and then hopefully next season maybe hit the ground running at a club if he's had 6 months to settle in. So obviously wish him all the best, but I think it's quite telling today that he got a better reception from those away supporters than the home ones.
I think it's an interesting point overall with the sort of transition thing and how it affects players, because it's easy for us to sit here and for fans who will probably end up being fans of the club for 80 years in a lot of cases to say, to almost not necessarily write off a couple of years, but to not have expectations in the short term. But these are players who, you know, are living their dreams and only really get the chance to do that for 15, 20 years. And it was something I spoke to Jack Stacey about a few weeks ago, actually, that they don't really have time to just write off a season and you know, forget about their ambitions. They need to think about the short term as well. And obviously for a lot of them, that's trying to maybe surprise people with what Norwich can do. But maybe in Barnes' case and in a few other cases, the best thing might be to go elsewhere so that you can achieve as much as possible in your short career.
Yeah, and that's an interesting element, I think, that gets lost. And Paddy, just to sort of finish the pod and look to January more generally before we go on to just the ticket segment, I mean, that homegrown element's particularly pertinent with Norwich because it is a fine line. I mean, we sort of looked at the rules as we were on the walk up here. They need 7 in the matchday squad plus what they describe as like a club developed player, so an academy player, which would be Brad Hills at the moment, as of today in today's matchday squad. But they are thin on homegrown options, and that's going to probably prove troublesome, if not in the January window, then definitely next summer. It's going to have to be a factor of what they do from a recruitment perspective.
Oh yeah, it almost feels like, from the soundings you get, that's like the central pillar of what they're going to try and do in these next 2 windows, that they have to have a little bit more wriggle room, for want of a better phrase, because the alternative is if you don't have that 7/8 in your matchday squad, you can't name a matchday squad of 20. You know, you have to take players off your bench, and what head coach wants to turn around and, you know, it's almost Sunday Parks football, that you don't have enough players to make up a bench, you know, sort of thing. But so both the lads have referenced, you know, there's the Kay Gordon scenario, potentially an Ashley Barnes scenario. But if they were to depart, or any players that would tick the homegrown box in here and now in this squad, they'd have to find another homegrown option because they're on the cut line as it is now. You see, Liam Gibbs is out for, you know, maybe another 2 months. He would tick a box, but it doesn't take many injuries of your homegrowns to really leave you in quite a tight spot. And for me, that might impact eventually, you know, Brad Hills. You know, Johannes has spoken recently about, do we get him out on loan in January? Does he go and play football? And that's probably maybe what he needs. You know, he had a successful loan stint in Accrington at League 2. Maybe you look at a League 1 loan for him for the second part of this season. Will they actually be in a position to do that? You know, if they're that tight on homegrowns, whether it be players go back in January who are homegrown, or, you know, you've got 1 or 2 injuries that you're carrying, like a Gibbs, longer term injuries, then that could scupper Brad Hills going out the door, and that's not ideal in any way, shape or form. It's not ideal for the player. It's not ideal for the club, who want him to go out and, like Adam Boyega's doing now, you know, play regularly at a good level and really kick on in their development, so they come back next summer a bit closer to the Norwich first team. So, yeah. I mean, I had another conversation with a Norwich official after today's game, and they were pouring a lot of cold water on that Sheffield United link. That they seem to think that might be very agent-led, almost just to put Barnes' name out there with a view to, would there be any other potential clubs who would come and, Ashley Barnes is potentially available. Well, he might fit our profile. So it felt very much like a fishing exercise, but that doesn't mean that there won't be interest in him, or they decide to cut the losses on Kay Gordon, even though he got on today for a few minutes. And if they were to make those decisions, then a lot of what they do in Jan and maybe the summer to an extent will have to be with the homegrown in mind. So there's no doubt it is now increasingly, it feels like, becoming quite a big card in their transfer strategy, because, you know, it doesn't exactly set the tone really about, you know, we're about developing younger players if you're not actually meeting the homegrown criteria. And I know it's not all about developing homegrown young players, but nevertheless, it sort of flies in the face a little bit of, it's about, you know, cultivating younger players who can come in and move a club forward. So, yeah, you know, I think that's definitely one to watch in these next 2 windows, about how much of their business, inward and outward, or how much of the decisions they make on recruitment are influenced by the homegrown criteria.
Yeah, indeed. And obviously some of those under 21 players and whatnot aren't included in that homegrown quota for obvious reasons. So that makes it all the more difficult as well. So that's going to be a fascinating sort of subplot of Norwich City's transfer windows. And obviously the likes of Jonathan Rowe and Abu Kamara and whatnot, who were here as of the summer, haven't helped that situation in any stretch really in terms of what they want to do. And we know, because when you recruit domestically, it's often more expensive. So there's that challenge that brings, and January windows are notoriously difficult anyway. So yeah, that's going to be interesting to see quite how they go about manoeuvring that situation. Obviously, if it's a situation where we're talking about a Christian Fashnak going out, then that's obviously an easier sort of situation to manage and deal with. Right, let's end the pod with just the ticket then. This, of course, is our segment in association with our sponsors, First Bus, where we pick out a player who was just the ticket. I'll let you guys have the week, because I think we can basically go from, maybe include Portsmouth in this as well, although pretty slim pickings. Yeah, pretty slim pickings. I'm going to go first on this occasion and give you lads some thinking time. I'm going to go for Oscar Schwartau today, who I thought was...
I'm going to go first. What a selfless act.
To be fair, I went last week, so it's I'm all about balance. So yeah, Oscar Schwartau I thought came in today on that right hand side. I was a little bit concerned initially about how it would pan out with Fisher. They're two kind of players who want to invert and go in the pitch, but actually I thought it was quite effective. I thought he was good in his pressing. He's a player that I think is really growing into, actually. And when we talk about year two, I'm very excited about an Oscar Schwartau year two, as opposed to maybe what he's had this year, which is just sort of almost drip feeding him the Championship. He's a player that doesn't look 18, and that sort of bit of skill in the second half where he basically dragged the ball from behind him past the defender was incredible. Shame we won't talk about the cross that followed it, which wasn't as incredible, but there's just signs there of life, I think, with him. So yeah, I think he was just the ticket for me. Sam, I'll let you go next because you've got a microphone in your hand.
Yeah, fair. I'm going to say Jose Cordoba, who I think actually overall, I said there wasn't anyone from Portsmouth game who maybe deserved recognition, but I suppose as a centre-back in a board draw, you often get the credit, and I think he deserved it for that one. That was a pretty good, pretty assured performance, and even when Norwich were going quite a lot more direct, I thought he found probably more passes than a lot of his colleagues. And then obviously today scores actually what I think he made look quite an easy header, as he makes a lot of things look. But
I think, and this is via Chris Gorham, who's usually obviously very spot on, that was his first ever senior goal in club football.
Yeah, well, I knew it was his first one
correct.
for Norwich, but yeah, I suppose that makes sense. And well, you can see how much it meant, couldn't you, from his celebration? I think he went and did his first bit, and then he went
nearly on Carrow Bridge. He was running towards that corner.
Yeah, went and had a bit more with the river end afterwards. So yeah, clearly he was very happy with that. And I actually thought, although it's strange when Norwich concede 2 goals that were probably relatively avoidable, that you can praise the centre backs and not point to any major errors, but I didn't think he really did much wrong today. I thought it was another assured performance. On the ball, he always looks pretty calm, although I think you can tell teams are maybe pressing now to get Shane Duffy on the ball more. So we don't see that too often, but yeah, he always looks calm on the ball and actually calm out of it, to be fair. But yeah, manages things quite well defensively. I thought he did that today, and obviously got his goal. So yeah, overall a pretty decent week for him, and I thought he was just the ticket.
Paddy?
Callum Fisher's now just the ticket. For me, right-hand side of the defence, inverting, clever, technical player, very comfortable in those central midfield areas. Any debate there was between him and Stacey, which we've had over recent weeks, I think that's done for me now. And that isn't a negative towards Jack Stacey necessarily, but in a lot of this podcast we've talked about is about this Hoff-ball evolution. Callum Fisher is far better suited to play that than Jack Stacey, there's absolutely no doubt. Where they've obviously fallen between stools in the recent weeks is well, 2 things really. It was obviously they moved Callum Fisher over to the left against West Brom to deal with that Tom Fellows, who's a very, very good player, wide player. And he kind of got stuck there, I thought, then for the next game or two, because obviously they started to pick up a few decent results, and maybe the head coach was of a mind to, well, we won't upset too much now. But I mean, QPR was the one in terms of Fisher on the left. It just doesn't feel natural, and it closes down the play rather than opening up the pitch for me. So seeing him on the right today and how he played, like the rest of his teammates in that first 45 minutes or so. Because the other part of that dimension was, of course, when Johannes was talking about, well, Jack Stacey gives you so much more in an overlapping attacking sense, and felt they were too imbalanced. There was too much reliance on both sides. There was nothing really coming from the right-hand side. But I feel particularly Sargent comes back in, well, you see the strides that Cernach is making. I think he will offer that on the right-hand side. So I think him in tandem with Fisher moving forward is just a better fit for how Thorup wants to progress the ball and deep build-up phases of play. So, yeah, Callum Fisher is just a ticket.
Adam?
Oh, he left me with little to nothing. Let's go, maybe not for his performances, because I think there's a lot more to come, but Marcelino Núñez has made himself available for 2 games this week when it's been quite evident.
It's slim here, aren't we?
Quite evident that
He was quite good today.
No, he was.
he was better, yeah. But I think on the whole, the fact he's had to push through 90 minutes twice, even after the QPR game as well, due to injury, suspensions, whatever it might be, and he's obviously still managing a situation. I thought, maybe not his best on Tuesday, but certainly better again today. And I'm sure once he gradually continues to get himself back up to speed, that those performances we saw in and around the sort of early part of the season and sort of mid part of the season, mid part of the first half of the season, will return, because he's a pretty good player at this level.
Yeah, I thought he did well in that 6th role, particularly in the first half, actually. Difficult role to take on. Obviously one that Kenny McLean has played predominantly, and actually his quality and possession probably helped Norwich in a lot of that good build-up stuff that we spoke about. So, yeah, not a bad shout, that one. Gents, thank you very much. Thank you all very much for watching and listening. We'll see you obviously next week after that long pre-Christmas trip to Sunderland. Hats off to anyone of a Norwich City persuasion making that one. And hopefully we're talking about the better face of Norwich City. See you then.